Hello and welcome to the fifth video in this series. It's actually not my first time recording this. It's taken a few tries because I really want to get it right. So this video is going to be different than other videos in the fact that I really don't have to go over so much of the content in this video. What I assigned my students in the classroom and what I suggest you actually watch before this video is a talk by the scholar Mehsa Baradaran on her book, The Color of Money. And she gives this talk at the Economic Policy Institute. And really, she does my job for me. She does, a wonderful job of going through, all the economic policies towards Black Americans, beginning with the end of slavery all the way to the modern day. So what I'm going to do in this video is building off of that. And yes, so I recommend you go watch that. And then what we're going to do here is, the first thing is I'm going to go into a little bit on the Kerner Commission, which comes out in 1968. And it's really evaluating the economic and social injustices towards Black Americans that gave rise to the civil rights movement. So I want to briefly discuss that and connect it to the modern day, and then talk about what are the steps forward. So, with that, I'm actually just going to go ahead and jump right into the presentation, and I will recap the video that I mentioned. So if you don't want to watch all 40 minutes of it, just watch these 2 slides that I go over. And, hopefully I can briefly summarize, but clearly not to the extent that Baradaran can, the policies and the history. So let me go ahead and share my screen. All right, and I want to make sure my video is clear. Give me 1 second. There we go. All right. So this is the 5th week, focusing on policies after emancipation to the modern day. So to begin, let me touch on the video and, what are the main points that it makes? And there's plenty of them because there's plenty of policies that happen over this large span of time. So starting with the end of slavery, there actually is a kind of reparations given to the freed slaves. And this is a land grant. But soon after, President Johnson actually takes this back. And he takes this land back. And, the reason behind it has to do with the fact that, as these freed slaves are receiving this land, they are, putting it more towards subsistence and, their own agricultural output rather than cash crops. And this is posing a real challenge for the North, who their industry, which is mostly textile manufacturing, is very much based on cheap cotton from the South that requires free slave labor. So Johnson quickly takes this land back. And, he uses his language of free markets to justify it, saying you can buy this land back through your own hard work once you save up the money. But the South begins to form policies to keep Black labor cheap and keep producing cotton at a low cost. Something I want to point out is that, at the same time, land is being granted to white homesteaders and also railroads in the West. But the land given to freed slaves is taken back. So how is the South, restricting Black labor to stay cheap? Well, they really restrict their opportunities, their labor opportunities. And there's 2 main ways that the freed slaves can go. One is towards sharecropping, which I'm going to go into detail on this in the next slide, but it's essentially a system of agricultural production that is very much dependent on debt to plantation owners. And the other option is through incarceration. And this is the beginning of mass incarceration and the widespread use of prison labor. So this is essentially how they're keeping cotton cheap and how they're continuing to use black labor in the South in order to uh, funnel it towards uh, production in the North. And effectively, by 1877, they've taken away the freedom of labor, the freedom to vote, freedom of land. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are more or less nullified. And I add this note here that any wealth built within the Black community is essentially stolen or destroyed by whites. So any movement towards gaining wealth is prohibited. The freed slaves do get one concession, and that is the Freedmen's Bank. And it comes with an endowment. But, people start putting their money into this bank, and soon after, the commissioner of the bank, who is not a freed slave himself, he's a white man, speculates it all away on the railroads, and the entire money in the bank disappears. And, Mirza Baradaran tells us this actually is linked to still the lack of trust today in banks. You see, there's 10% of whites unbanked, but it's 60% of blacks. Fast forward, by 1910 through 1940, we begin to see the Great Migration north of Black Americans into segregated areas, and also the creation of, almost an independent economy for Black Americans, using Black banks, Black insurance dealers, Black churches. And, she also describes this as essentially a dysfunctional economy because as the blank banks are putting assets into property, there's a sort of tipping point where when a certain amount of Black households move into a neighborhood, suddenly that neighborhood's houses immediately lose value. So the wealth created in the Black community does not stay there, and this economy is essentially dysfunctional. By 1953, the New Deal comes about, and this is a significant moment in our economic history. However, racial exclusion is written into the New Deal, so as it's building the white American middle class through things like the FHA and the GI Bill, Black Americans are entirely left out of this. Loan risk, for example, is measured by race, which is what we know as redlining. The same thing goes for consumer loans. Let me move my video out of the way. They use revolving credits for white Americans and installment credit for Black Americans. What this essentially means is that there's a dual credit market, Black Americans lose their possessions, and white Americans build their wealth. By the 1960s, the civil rights movement is really focusing first on credit markets. And they take two approaches. The nonviolent approach is one for integration and reparations, and the Black Power approach is one fighting for, kind of anti-colonial sovereignty and for, separate economic institutions. What comes out of this is, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, etc. But these more or less, ensure rights Blacks already had, beginning with emancipation. So they reinstate these rights, and not a whole lot of gains are made. Because at this point, Nixon takes on the language of Black power, and he turns it into his own version of Black capitalism. Segregation remains, they create affirmative action, but it's largely challenged, and they make these unsuccessful deposits into Black banks, which do nothing to boost how Black Americans are faring economically. In the modern day, this language of Black capitalism in the ghetto has just been transformed into enterprise zones and community empowerment. The responsibility of inequality is on the shoulders of Black banks and businesses. And, the final thing that Baradaran leaves us with is she says, bankers did finally find opportunity in these areas in the subprime crisis. And the result of it was that 53% of Black households, 53% of wealth was lost by Black households. So this brings us to the modern day with the policy. But I do want to briefly touch on one thing because in the ninth video, uh, we're going to come back to talk about mass incarceration. So I want to briefly touch on that. But also, the bulk of Marisa Baradaran's scholarship is on banks. And I want to emphasize, the aspect of labor for just a minute. So, post-slavery, the South develops, a political, social, and economic caste system based off of race. Uh, and the way a lot of the labor goes, a lot of Black Americans end up using their labor in the economy, if you want to put it that way, is, they have no access to credit. So they begin leasing lands, tools, seed uh, from plantation owners in order to get into the agricultural economy, often in really unfair agreements. So they usually stay poor and they stay indebted. This only ends by, about the 1940s when mechanization increases in agriculture. And then, of course, this is part of the Great Migration, and they move north into segregated areas. And, again, what I wanted to say about mass incarceration is here, it really starts post-slavery. So they've developed laws that say you can be jailed for things like vagrancy, loitering, riding the rails, changing your job, talking too loud in public. And once you're a part of this system of incarceration, prisoners are leased essentially as slaves, but this time, because they're nobody's property and they can be easily replaced by just jailing more people, they can be worked to death. So this is the beginning of mass incarceration, which obviously continues to the modern day. And we're going to talk about this in a few videos from now, in the ninth video. Yeah, so with this, many move to the north into segregated jobs, and they stay as a cheap source of labor for white communities, and to an extent, industry. And I want to emphasize this quote from W.E.B. Du Bois. He says, "The slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, then moved back again toward slavery." All right, so this brings us to the Kerner Commission. The Kerner Report is commissioned by President Johnson because he wants to investigate the causes of civil unrest. So in 1968, they form this commission and they begin to gather data on, economic and social inequities among the African American community. And ultimately, what they do is they come to the conclusion of indicting white society, and they urge for specific legislation for racial integration and for slum enrichment through housing, job creation, etc. And we're going to go into a little bit of detail on this. And what ultimately happens is it's rejected by Johnson. But let's look at this report in more depth. So what are the grievances of African Americans in 1968? And I'll just name them off right now. 1, police practices. 2, unemployment and underemployment. 3, inadequate housing. 4, inadequate education. 5, poor recreation facilities and programs. 6, ineffectiveness of the political structure and grievance mechanisms. 7, disrespectful white attitudes. 8, discriminatory administration of justice. 9, inadequacy of federal programs. 10, inadequacy of municipal services. 11, discriminatory consumer and credit practices. 12, inadequate welfare programs. And I encourage you, and I'm sure you're already thinking about this actually, but how much of this is still relevant today? I think we have to think about that. So what are the solutions that the commission gives? 1, they say, let's open opportunities and eliminate barriers for jobs, education, and housing on a racial basis. 2, they want to remove powerlessness and increase private and public institutions in order to solve the problems faced by this community. 3, they want to increase cross-racial communication to create common ground in social justice. And 4, They want to end housing segregation into these areas that they term ghettos. And they want to motivate the private sector to create low-cost rental housing. If you live in LA like me, I'm sure you also wish that they started doing this in 1968. All right. So actually, I'm not going to read the whole report because I feel like that's going to get a little boring for you. But there's some really significant points in the report that I do just want to touch on briefly. Hold on. There we go. So first, they're describing how they got commissioned to write this report. And they say, this is our basic conclusion. Our nation is moving toward two societies, one Black, one white, separate and unequal. And this sets the tone for the rest of the report. They describe how this has been a significant problem, and really they confront the history of the United States. But they say it's not inevitable and that things can be changed, and they propose solutions. They say it'll require new attitudes, new understanding, and new will, maybe even new taxes in order to confront this. But the consequences, if we don't, is going to be, polarization of the American community, destruction of basic democratic values. And they write some really significant things here. And I'd like to read just one quote. Segregation and poverty have created in the racial ghetto a destructive environment totally unknown to most white Americans. What white Americans have never understood, but what the Negro can never forget, is that white society is deeply implicated in the ghetto. White institutions created it, white institutions maintain, and white society condones it. It is time now to turn with all the purpose at our command to the major unfinished business of this nation. It is time to adopt strategies for action that will produce quick and visible progress. It is time to make good the promises of American democracy to all citizens, urban and rural, white and Black, Spanish surname, American Indian, and every minority group. And then they describe three basic principles in order to solve this problem. One is that the scale has to be equal to, they write the dimension of the problems. Two, it has to be, high impact for the immediate future in order to close this gap. And then three, it's going to require new initiatives and experimentation. And they finally end with, there can be no higher priority for national action and no higher claim on the nation's conscience. And this is a commission coming from the government. I really think it represents a unique point in our history when, the government comes to face itself and to face the history and realizes the real dimension of these issues and what has been created. Something also interesting about this that we're going to continue to talk about throughout this video is that this isn't just an economic problem where you can hand over money and reparations and everything will be solved. But it's going to involve changing our understanding. It's going to involve, it says new political grievance mechanisms, and it's going to involve a real, move towards justice in all respects. So, I put a few questions here to think about, which is, in regards to this quote, where it says our nation is moving towards two societies, one Black, one white, separate and unequal. Have we become this society, separate and unequal? Have we seen the polarization that they say will come about if we don't do anything immediately? Have we seen the destruction of our democratic values? And then to what extent have we embraced the three basic principles that they outline? Can you think of instances where we have at all? I don't know. I know my students had a hard time actually with these questions. So what I want to do now is survey, so what happens between when the Kerner Commission is released and the modern day, at least statistically? What do the statistics tell us? Well, let's look at these graphs. We see that Over this period of time, beginning with the 60s to the modern day, white wealth has continued to increase dramatically, and Black wealth has more or less stagnated. If you look at the Black-white wealth gap, when the Kerner Commission was released, when the Kerner Report was released, the gap was around 9.4%. Today, not today, but 2016, it was around 8.7%. So in that whole period of time, it barely changed. It's nothing to celebrate. Even if you control for education, which is, usually used as an indicator of skill set or productivity, even if you control for that, all across the board, Black wealth lags significantly behind white wealth. You see that amongst those with advanced degrees, probably to the highest proportion, those with bachelor's degrees, some college, high school, less than high school, all across the board, education, productivity, skill set, irregardless of those, we see this gap. Now for homeownership, which I mentioned in the second video is, the primary way wealth is held and accumulated in the United States. There's consistently been a significant lag, and that has only increased over time. And it says Black homeownership is in retreat. And maybe we can look to what Mehrsa Baradaran says about the subprime crisis as an indicator of that. So even during the pandemic, Black businesses are hit twice as hard. And the same goes for many other consequences of the pandemic. If you look at access to food, it's worse. The Black Americans are worst hit. Lost income, it's Hispanics and then Blacks. Missed a mortgage payment, again, Black Americans. Missed a rent payment, again, Black Americans. So this continues to the modern day. So, what I want to look at now is how do we move forward? If we didn't take steps post-Kerner Commission, it's not too late. What can be done? And there's a portion of the talk by Mehrsa Baradaran in the question section that I really want to look at. So let me go ahead and play that. I'm just going to play it in another tab. My Wi-Fi is a little tricky. Oops. Oh, there it is. Okay.
20 Black banks in this country, right? That is not, you cannot put the onus on them. It's not their problem. At what was
I just realized that you wouldn't have heard any of that. Let me go back.
take money out and use it for a force of good. But if you talk to Black bankers and you say, like, how are you creating wealth? There's 20 Black banks in this country, right? That is not, you cannot put the onus on them. It's not their problem. They didn't create this problem. So what is the solution? I think you're talking, you have to be talking reparations. Yeah. You have to be talking some sort of, land, property, capital, looking at what was done and what was taken and what was not given. And I don't want to talk about, everyone wants to go to the reparations discussion to like step 5, which is how exactly does this work? And I don't want to go there. Right? We need to start with step 1 is like, we need to like do truth and reconciliation and all the stuff that happened after all the bad things other countries did. And I think what the US did is that we have this institution of slavery and then Jim Crow and then segregation, and we use all of these myths to justify it. So first we're saying, well, God ordained the white man master and the black man slave. And then we're saying, well, science, and look at these skull measurements and the pseudoscience social Darwinism crap. And we've got these racial orders and it's evolution. And now I think we use this law of the market or whatever as sort of dogma. But what happens after slavery is we have these dogmas of white supremacy to justify slavery. We end slavery and we don't look at those dogmas and say, hey, we needed those myths to justify this institution that was actually an economic institution. We wanted cheap labor, and we had guns, and we took cheap labor, and then we had to create this myth so we're not the evil ones, right? So now we don't need that myth. Let's get rid of it. So what's happened is when we get rid of those institutions, those myths linger. And I think what reparations and truth and reconciliation does is have us confront those myths of racial superiority and inferiority. We as a nation, created whiteness, right? We created race to justify all of these things. And I think I see reparations, and maybe again, call me like super hopefully naive, but I see it as healing for everybody. I think it could be a real sort of I mean, as an example, when the Kerner Commission came out, Marlon Brando read the whole thing on TV. I mean, the Kerner Commission is as close that we came to truth and reconciliation, because that report is really stark. It was, really clear. And so I think we need something like that. I think there are other solutions to closing the racial wealth gap. I think reparations is over here as a thing that has to happen to get over all that stuff. But I think there's racial wealth gap solutions that could be done immediately. Housing, right? Capital. So instead of opportunity zones, actually hand over properties in these areas with financing like we did with FHA. So you're paying just as much as you did in rent, you get the down payment. And these things are actually being operationalized by some of the candidates that I'm proud to have worked with and put together some plans. So housing, you can't talk about racial wealth gap and all this stuff without talking about schools. We have a segregated school system. We have property taxes. I mean, taxing was a race-based thing, right? Your property taxes fund your schools. So you've got different schools, different funding. You can't talk about social capital. You've got to talk about criminal justice. You've got to talk about policing. I mean, all of this stuff ends up being together. But it, I think, stems from segregation and these, the wealth gap, right?
All right. So I think she makes some really wonderful points here, which is that if you want to talk about decreasing the wealth gap, you have to also acknowledge she mentions criminal justice, the education system, taxation, and it has to start with confronting the myths that we've built up, that we would have talked about in the third video about slavery, especially the section where I refer to Joy DeGroy's work. And if you watched her video, I think this is abundantly clear how we've kept those myths and internalized them. And it's so integral to changing our economic reality is first confronting these narratives. So let's talk a little bit about that. She suggests truth and reconciliation as a possible way of moving forward. So what is truth and reconciliation? It's best defined as, the recognition of the dignity of individuals, the redress and acknowledgement of violations, and the aim to prevent them from happening again. It takes place in a safe forum to air grievances and enter them into the public record. It can include gathering stories, public broadcasts, and recommendations. And then, ultimately, victims are the ones who determine the structure, the mandate, the recommendations. This has taken place in over 46 different countries. In Argentina, about the dictatorship. In Rwanda, about the genocide. In El Salvador, about the civil war. The Solomon Islands, about ethnic conflict. The list goes on and on. So why haven't we taken this on in the United States? And what are the bottlenecks that we might face in moving towards something like a Truth and Reconciliation Commission? So this is the exact question posed in this video I'm going to show right here. And I'm going to fast forward it a little bit to the relevant section, just so this doesn't go on too long.
We have a problem in the United States with respect to truth and reconciliation hearings. As Paul will tell you, that is largely a political process that you need the political will to be able to move forward. The truth and reconciliation process, I monitored a little bit of it in 1997, happened after the country had made a political transition. This country is still in the process of making a political transition, which then brings us to the Attorney General. The Attorney General, Keith Ellison, Had the people of Minnesota not lived through the past 5, 6, 7, 10, 15 years of police violence against Black people. It is a symbol that the times have changed, and they've elected someone who is willing to move that change forward. Last point, the police are the problem, but they're not the only problem. Paul will tell you that apartheid ran deep, and the policing was a mechanism, a symptom of social control. It is the same here, that situations go much deeper in the United States than policing, including what was made bare by COVID and the inequality and the way that Black people don't have access to what they need.
All right. So that begins to introduce us to some of the questions that I'm going to pose here in the discussion. Is truth and reconciliation really possible with our current government and political environment? I write here, why do we need it? I feel like that might be a little clear, but go ahead and think about that as well if you feel it's necessary. And then why haven't we yet tried truth and reconciliation? How can we make it successful if there are certain bottlenecks in our country? And then, the final question is, is it enough? And I feel, Marisa Baradaran suggests, no, it's not enough. There's a lot more that has to be done. So yes, what else has to be done to heal our country? In many ways, this even goes back to the discussion portion of the prior video, where I was talking about, once, narratives of how the markets are a free system where everyone has opportunity. Once these narratives really take over, how do we confront them? And how do we begin to build responses that are adequate to solving what has happened through government policy, really, and through the myths that we've created? So I'm going to stop there. And all right. So our first video is about slavery, about settler colonialism. I feel like they were, fairly clear on how they connect to the larger buildup towards industrialization. And then these last two videos, they kind of follow up on the previous videos to give some clarity to what happens to these populations afterwards. But to a lesser extent, do they connect to the economic trajectory of the United States? So next week, we're jumping back to talk about American interventionism abroad, which again, kind of connects more to that, clear narrative trajectory that we're building on. And then, yes, we go on to talk about things like neocolonial institutions and migration and mass incarceration. So I feel like there's more clarity there. But I hope something about these past two videos is they've also brought a little bit of clarity to understanding the issues of inequality in this country and how it's strongly linked to race. But yes, next week we're coming back to talk about American interventionism abroad. And, the assigned reading and video, which, I always put below in the description, it is a brief introduction to the book Overthrow by Stephen Kinzer. And it's only about 6 pages, but I think it's, a good basis to read. And then it's also his talk at Google, which are a great resource. And there he talks about his book, The Brothers, about the Dulles brothers, who strongly influence American foreign policy, which has strong links to the US economy that we're going to talk about. So I encourage you to watch those videos. He's a very animated speaker, so I think it's quite interesting. But I will leave you there. And thank you so much for listening, and I hope you continue with these videos. Thank you so much.